How's everybody doing? How's the energy in the room? I can see big smiles, big eyes. People look inspired and enthusiastic. This is exactly what we like to see. I hope some of those insights inspire you to take big leaps in the projects that you're launching. This is, after all, a celebration of talent, about the enterprise behind startups. You know, we're trying to create a community here that people can share our ideas, but also have a sense of solidarity as well. Because we know it's a tough journey, but we also know it's a journey that's worth celebrating. And this year, at this new venue here at Dubai Harbour, we're really excited that North Star has expanded, hence the title. So this is really exciting. It's a brilliant addition to GITEX Global. I've had the privilege to support GITEX over the years. My name's Amandeep. I'm going to be with you over the next few days. But I will be giving myself a break and allowing other people to also grace the stage. So the next up, we have an exclusive session, and it's entitled A Closer Look from one of the earliest investors of climate tech. So this is really interesting. This is an intersection of the very key, crucial issue of climate change with technology. We're going to be hearing a lot more of this here in this country because, of course, the UAE is very proud to be hosting COP28 from the end of next month. So this is a really topical session that we've got for you. The special guest with us is Sean O'Sullivan, General Partner of SOSV US. I think the clutter behind me, that was perhaps a dramatic, drum roll for him. And it's going to be moderated by His Excellency, Dr. Tariq bin Hendi, who is Senior Partner of Global Ventures. So I'm going to hand over to these very expert hands, and please do join me in giving them a very warm welcome. Over to you, Your Excellency, and to Sean O'Sullivan as well. Please do take the stage. Thank you so much. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much. Great to hand over to your expert hands. Welcome.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah.
Hello,
Hi,
hello.
everyone. I'm here with Mr. Sean. This guy is a very brilliant investor, but also kind of leading a lot of the initiatives globally in terms of not just the alternative production of energy, but the alternative consumption of energy in terms of how it is that we consume products, food, how things are made, so on and so forth. So I think Sean's got a presentation that he's going to give to everybody, and then I'm going to enjoy having a fireside chat with him.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I'm Sean O'Sullivan. I'm with SOSV, and quick question for you guys. Does anyone here believe in climate change? Just got to know who I'm talking to. A lot of people do believe in climate change. That's good. I'm going to cover a little bit about what caused climate change and where we are going from it. But a little bit about SOSV first. I don't have anything on the monitor here, but so I can see what's going on, I think. Let's see. Next slide, please, or how do I do this? Well, I can talk.
It's always funny when the technology doesn't work in a technology exhibition, so it's going to be...
So SOSV is one of the world's most active investors in the climate world. We invest in about 100 new startups every year. We have $1.5 billion in assets under management. Can we go back a couple of slides? Or can I tell you when to advance? SOSV has... can you go back? Yeah, that's fine. No, go ahead and leave the quote on. So we've been investing in climate tech since, does it work? No. So we've been investing in climate tech since about 2007. And we have a climate tech summit, for example. Well, I guess we're just going to have a conversation. But let's just talk about how climate tech actually started. About 200 years ago, we started with the petrochemical age, and we started with the industrial age at the same time through the discovery of the steam engine in the UK. And what happened then, it was 200 years ago, 1 billion people on the planet. Up to that moment in time, there was the fastest man had ever traveled was on the back of a galloping horse. That was it. Now, I've just recently come over from...
I think they have your clicker.
I can just tell you next. Okay, that's fine. Can you go back one? Great, thank you. Since the creation of the industrial age in 200 years ago, the population went from 1 billion people to 2 billion people in just 100 years. Now, that was based off of the back of this incredible industrial production that we were able to achieve through the use of these machines and through the use of petrochemicals. And petrochemicals themselves have been the driver for our prosperity and the abundant lives that we've been able to live. And in the last 100 years, we went from 2 billion people to 8 billion people. In my lifetime alone, from 1964, when I was born, it actually hit 3 billion people. And in that time, since 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion, 8 billion people. Now, we each consume about 25,000 pounds of product, manufactured and produced product every year. That may seem strange. I weigh about 70 kilograms, 170 pounds or whatever. How can I consume so much product? Well, I just flew here from New York. That was about 1,000 pounds of fuel, for example, just to fly for me, many times my body weight, just in the fuel that I used to get here today. So we are continuously, as a human race, consuming a tremendous amount of product each day and each year. Thousands of pounds of food to feed our bodies, etc. So what we have to actually do, if we're going to have 8 billion people, or soon 10 billion people on the planet, is not necessarily consume less, but change our means of production so that we aren't producing the greenhouse gases as we live abundant lifestyles. Next slide, please. So about 1 billion people actually consume 74% of the entire world's greenhouse gas consumptions, or produce 74% of the world's greenhouse gas consumption. In the next 25 years, by 2050, the wealth that we have created and the wealth that we are continuing to see will actually improve the quality of everyone's life, so that there will be, instead of 1 billion people, next slide, there will be actually more than 3 billion people living at that quality of life standard. And so therefore, we'll need 3 times the trees, we'll need 3 times the metals, 3 times the concrete, 3 times the water, 3 times the air travel. And that actually is going to be very hard because we only have the one planet, and already the planet is heating up. So how are we going to change that? Well, we actually just have to, as I said, change the means of production. So that the things that we're producing, from the energy, from the food, from the transportation, don't actually generate greenhouse gases. And I'm here to tell you, this looks really bad. It looks like we're heading into a disaster, but I'm here to tell you there are solutions on the way. Next slide, please. But there are no easy answers. Everybody says, hey, what happened if you just suck all the carbon out of the air? This is a plant in Iceland that is very large. I don't know if you can see the person standing at the bottom of the railing there on that, but this only sucks enough carbon out of the air to suck the equivalent of 850 cars worth. You could park 850 cars in a structure that's this size. So, and it's extraordinarily expensive. It's hundreds of dollars per ton to remove the carbon. This is not a viable solution. It's a good effort, and we'll continue improving these technologies, but we cannot actually just suck the carbon out of the air. That's not going to work. Next slide, please. What we have to instead do is take some of the worst performing areas of what produces the carbon and actually take those means of production, change the means that we produce these things. From the ice creams and the leathers and the nylons and all of the different fertilizer products, we need to make these much more efficient. Next slide. So SOSV, as the world's most active climate tech investor, has been investing in all these sectors, from food, energy, transportation systems, building systems, the means of how we build our built environment. Next slide, please. These are different companies. But we have to bear in mind one thing. You never change things, according to Buckminster Fuller's quote here, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Now, the first thing I did when I graduated university is I created street mapping on computers. If you've ever typed an address into, this was about 40 years ago, or 35 years ago, and if you've ever typed an address into a computer and seen a street map, that's what my first company did. It grew to be a couple $100 million revenue company it was called MapInfo, and thousands of people built their technologies on our technology. And so if you got here today using a cab and you typed in an address, et cetera, that was the originator for that. The company went public back in 1993, even before the internet had started. But that was a new model. Before that, the model was to have paper maps. And paper maps actually didn't do all the things that this new model did in creating interactive maps that enabled all these new technologies. So that's what we need to do, but we need to do this for all the things that are currently producing and generating carbon. So next slide, please. Proteins. Animal proteins are particularly bad. They generate massive amounts of greenhouse gases, massive amounts of methane, for example. We look at the food that we eat. All of the food that's produced on the planet is responsible for 30% of our greenhouse gases. If we had stopped the population at 2 billion people, we would not have a global warming problem. But we didn't stop. We have actually 8 billion growing to 10 billion. And the use of animal products is actually making things worse. So next slide, please. So we have solutions to this. We can produce milk, for example, and meats for 30 times less greenhouse gases using plants, like Notco does. Notco is one of our unicorn companies, 100 million in revenue after only 5 years of existence, growing very rapidly, very well known in Latin America. Next slide, please. Also produce meats. Burger King uses their meat products, again, without having to generate the methane that a cow would produce. Next slide, please. There's another way of producing milks or any animal protein or any plant protein using bioreactors. And Perfect Day produces milk, next slide please, using bioreactors. What are bioreactors? If you've ever seen like a beer hall and you take inputs, feedstocks into a beer hall, there's an organisms called yeast inside that which take the feedstock and output a different product. That's the same thing a bioreactor does. You take in a feedstock like wheat or milk or whatever a cow would use as a feedstock, oxygen, nitrogen, all the things a cow would consume, and then the output is milk and poop and methane. We just drop all the methane, we drop all the poop, and we have 30 times more efficient ways of producing milk at a quarter of the cost. So this is not necessarily something that needs to impact the wallet of the consumer. It needs to be affordable and scalable for all consumers. Next slide, please. So, when you talk about these things, and when we first invested in that company that produces milk without cows, we were told, hey, that's ridiculous. No one's ever going to eat the product. It became the fastest growing ice cream brand in the United States in just a few years. And it took about 7 years from it to go from an idea to having 1 million people consume it. It will probably take another 10 years for the first billion people to consume these products and another 2 years after that for the second billion people. But that's the nature of exponential technologies. It takes a long time to get to 1 million, and it doesn't take hardly any time at all to get to 1 billion or 2 billion or 3 billion. And at first, people will ignore you, then they'll ridicule you, make fun of you, then they attack you, and then, if you're lucky, you win. Next slide, please. Another company we backed is the world's leader in producing meat without animals. Again, using a different type of bioreactor, Upside Foods, produces meat without having to slaughter an animal. Next slide, please. We also produce fish meat without animals. Next slide, please. And egg whites from a company, Every, which can produce that without chickens. Next slide, please. The worst food you can possibly eat per pound in terms of greenhouse gas generation is shrimp. That's partially because of the transportation and the cold, the storage needed to transport it around in the world from where it's created to where it's sold. And we have a company called Vertical Oceans, which just grows it right nearby in your local city in bio facilities that maintain its freshness, et cetera, and very efficiently cost competitive with shrimp as it exists today. Next slide, please. We can even take outputs of coal plants and feed those outputs, the carbon dioxide that's generated from the energy production, and use that by organisms which will consume that carbon dioxide and produce fish meal to feed fish. Next slide, please. And we can grow crops in these increasingly difficult climates using extremophiles from different parts of the world. Next slide, please. In the energy sector, there's a lot that can be done as well, using cellulosic waste to produce fuels. Next slide, please. We can also take regular ethanol-style plants and produce high-energy, sustainable aviation fuel using bioprocessed inputs. So you can have very high energy density. The problem with ethanol is it's not very high energy density. You can never fly a plane with it because you need to have the weight of the fuel be low compared to the energy it produces. This type of company can produce airline fuel. Next slide, please. Even oil wells, which previously, after the oil is explored and exploited, there's 2.5 million oil wells that are empty in the United States. They go for miles down. You can use those oil wells as gravity wells to store solar and wind energy very efficiently, and that's another way of actually dealing with these new energy technologies. Next slide, please. We have a company that allows you to create hydrogen out of the burnt gases, which are normally, in some cases, wasted. Next slide, please. And we have other companies that provide lots of technologies for distillation and purification. It may seem boring, but these kinds of technologies, this company, this distillation and purification process actually consumes about 18% of the entire United States energy supply, the electricity supply, something you never thought about. But the heating and cooling processes are very energy intensive. This can reduce the energy using nanofiltration technologies by 90%. These are the ways that we have to reinvent our economy, by changing our means of production so that we're generating less greenhouse gases. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, this is interesting. Right now your diapers are filling up lots of landfills. If you have babies, they're filling up lots of landfills. They're made from petrochemicals. This is super absorbent polymers that are produced actually don't biodegrade for over 400 years. But with these new bioprocessed biomaterials, it's cost competitive as well as it biodegrades in just 90 days. Next slide, please. Hydrogen is a great part of the solution. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And there are many ways of reducing the costs of storage and production of hydrogen. Next slide, please. Volt Storage is our German company that's the world's largest provider of vanadium flow batteries. We also have iron salt batteries for utility scale coverage. They've just received $50 million in funding for continuing that generation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. If you ever had stretchy fabric like nylon pants or those yoga pants or whatever, a lot of stretchy fabric uses this thing called nylon 66. That produces 300 times more damaging greenhouse gases for the environment than any other, than carbon dioxide. It's worse than methane, it's worse than most everything. So Ozone Bio produces adipic acid without that energy intensive process. Next slide, please. So biology itself is actually a way of reducing the energy consumption by 30 to 300 times less than the chemical processes that dominated the 1900s and dominated how we produce the petrochemical industries. So use of more biology is as a way of producing energy, electricity, and more efficient outputs is a key way that instead of requiring 3 planets that we talked about in the beginning for the needs of the human race, we can actually take less than 1 planet to produce the same quality of life that we currently would expect, and an abundant life. This is a company that just scrapes the biomass off of ships. It's a robotics company. It's like a Roomba, but for a ship. And you can save 18% of the fuel. That's $1 million, $2 million, up to $10 million a year. The cost of cargo ships is actually the biggest cost of moving things around is the fuel. And it makes a big difference there. Next slide, please. You can do the same thing for, next slide, please. You can do the same thing for air, for road transportation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And there's ways to use battery technologies. Next slide, please. And there's ways to use wind to move cargo containers around. Next slide, please. You can suck water out of the air in places like this part without having to desalinate the water. It's 20 times cheaper than desalination. Next slide, please. And you can create new processes for copper. So we have invested in all these companies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And we do this through, go ahead, next, click. We do this by running these wet labs and facilities at SOSV where we work with the biology and we have the technologies for genetic engineering and sequencing and protein characterization and biologic development. Next slide, please. We also do the same thing at our programs, HACS. So last slide was for ENBD, which is one of the ways that we back companies. HACS is our program for doing electrical, chemical, and the physical types of developments of products. Next slide, please. Now, all the money that exists in the world is shown here, right? So $90 trillion is the amount of money that sits in cash right now. There's about $73 trillion that sits in global stock markets. Now, that $7 trillion is shown in its proportionate size for all the private companies that exist around the world. So venture capital is actually a very, very small and very important piece of the equation, but it only is this little piece right here, the $1 trillion in venture capital. Now, the amount that's spent at the seed level, getting these ideas rolling and getting them ready for production, that's this amount. And then in terms of the amount, the sort of invisible amount there is the amount of money that's being spent on the ideas that we've just gone over in terms of fueling the climate transition. There's plenty of opportunity for us to have a bright and sustainable future. We have hundreds of companies that we've backed in the climate area. We only invest about $100 million a year into these companies, but the follow-on investors that invest with us, which SOSV is entirely dependent on, invest $2 to $2.5 billion a year in helping scale these companies. So I'm here to tell you, next slide please, that we can fight the existing reality by creating new models that make the existing model obsolete. Next slide, please. And the quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase, is I think relevant. We don't know how we're going to get out of this climate problem. We know that it's in the news every night, but we do know that we can do better than we've done so far. And we also know from both a physics and a biology and a chemistry perspective, we can exist on this planet and live with abundance if we just change a few things about how we're making things in the first place. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you all for listening. So Sean, just a question here. Those are fascinating companies doing some very interesting things. The question is, more and more of the world's population are becoming middle class. They're consuming more of the traditional things that a lot of developed countries are focused on now as being the culprits of climate change, right? How is it that a lot of these portfolio companies and other innovators can try to preempt that growth in the middle class to help drive the consumption of some of these newer products?
Right. Well, it's not about, first and foremost, if these technologies don't work for the emerging markets, if they don't work for the world's poorest societies, then they won't work at all. Because, there's only there's the wealthiest people on the planet right now is only 1 out of 8, billion, right? So you actually have to make these technologies so much cheaper for everybody that it is eliminating the ways that we used to produce things. So by actually having milk which costs 1/4 of the cost and is healthier milk for you to consume, it's healthier for society, and doesn't create the greenhouse gas as a side effect, really, the real benefit is getting to that point where we have enough scale to be able to produce these products cheaper than the existing means of production.
Yeah, and that tends to, when I was in the government, a lot of the big initiatives were around how do you reduce the energy consumption for things like desalination, right? And some of that comes into play is, do you change consumers' behavior, or do you change the way that we source our energy product, or is it both, right? And what's the best way to approach this?
Good luck trying to change human behavior. Everybody wants to live an abundant lifestyle. When everybody gets enough bucks in their pocket, they try to buy a car. When everybody, gets enough bucks in their pocket, they try to fly to some exotic location and have a great vacation, and they try to add more meat to their diets. The thing we have to do is change our means of how we produce these products and make the new means actually more, more, not just better for you, but also better for the environment.
One of the arguments that I've heard from counter positions on some of these products, whether it's eggs or milk or you name it, is that, well, if it's not produced from a real animal, then religiously, right, we struggle with understanding how you can actually make that halal or abide by other requirements. So how do you get around some of that perception, at least in the early adoption of some of this technology?
Well, when you produce things from plants in the first place, plant proteins, it's generally halal in the first place, right? So that's one thing. But also, even some of the rules about halal or kosher foods, et cetera, relate to the animal that the product is from. And because, believe it or not, in the Bible or something, it says that, you can't eat meat from a cloven animal with cloven feet. But if you can produce the meat, say pork, without actually having the cloven feet, who's to say it's not kosher, or halal? So these are things that people are. These meats, for example, are now the first vegan meats, right? So vegans can now eat these products because it doesn't involve the slaughter of an animal in doing it. So it's opening up new horizons for people, but also. The other thing is that there's a lot of terrible things about the products that we eat already. For example, milk, cow's milk. 75% of people on the planet are actually allergic to lactose, and only about 25% of the people that are allergic to lactose even realize that they are allergic to lactose. So, lactose, by the way, is a tasteless. It's a sugar, okay, so it has lots of calories, but it's a tasteless sugar, so it's not adding to the sweetness of the milk, and it's odorless and everything. But if you take out the lactose, all you're doing is you're now providing a lower calorie milk with the same quality and the same performance characteristics. It'll still whip up, and you can still use it as a baking product, etc., in ingredients, the way you would a regular milk. So you have a product that's healthier for you, that's also healthier for the environment because you're not pumping these cows full of steroids, to make them grow bigger, and antibiotics to make them, fatter, etc., and therefore really causing the degradation of the human health characteristics of having these antibiotics fail to work on humans, because you're creating super resistant viruses and bacteria. So by doing it this way, it actually is making a product better for you, better for humanity, and better for human health.
So as a final question for me, just in the interest of time, what is one piece of advice that you can give everybody in the room here in terms of the easiest thing that they can do today to start helping the world from a climate tech perspective? And I'm not talking about non-plastic straws in a plastic cup, right?
Right. Yeah, a lot of people think, they're thinking the most obvious thing to do is buy an electric car or something, right? Actually, it doesn't make that much of a difference. It's only 2% of your greenhouse gas footprint is saved by buying an electric car. And a lot of the reasons for that is because the energy that you're consuming with the electric car is coming from petrochemicals in the first place. For most, if you had a completely renewable energy supply charging your electric car, then you would actually be able to reduce it by 4%. But you can't, because you can't change the infrastructure. So the way you could actually reduce your greenhouse emissions personally by 20%, 10 times more than buying an electric car, is by getting animal agriculture out of your diet. Now, I love my ice cream, and so I have my ice cream, but I can have my ice cream now with these vegan products, and it's the same cost, and it's the same quality. It's not like the old vegan ice cream where it tasted like terrible. You can actually buy like Mars and like these. It's not available in all markets yet, but it's available in the United States. They have these ice creams that are made using these perfect day proteins, and it tastes great. It's phenomenal. So if you can get animals out of your diet, you can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. Massive contribution you can make.
I want to thank you all for listening. I also want to thank Sean for sharing this knowledge and information with us. And if you want to talk to an expert, you should come grab him when we walk off the stage. So thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Tariq.